the question box if you want to communicate with us. The plan is for our panelists to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the session to questions. You'll be able to ask a question by typing your question in the panel that's found on the right side of your screen. So at this point, I'd like to start the webinar. One measure of success of the USAID water strategy that was launched in 2013 is the provision of sustainable water supply and improved sanitation. Long-term sustainability of WASH services is recognized as a complex challenge, and it's dependent on both the hardware and software elements, including behavior, policy, monitoring, financial support, and so on. This complexity demands a comprehensive tool to forecast the long-term sustainability of particular WASH interventions. And the WASH Sustainability Index tool supports a new measurement paradigm that allows us to focus on monitoring programs and to shift towards long-term impact, far beyond the life of the project itself. This assessment focuses on services delivered over time rather than number of systems built, and the tool is created for post-project assessment. However, you will note as you look through the tool that indicators and questions within the tool can be used during the planning process as well. At this point, I'd like to turn over the discussion to Harold Lockwood and Ryan Schweitzer of AgriConsult to provide a detailed look at the WASH Sustainability tool.
Thank you, Helen. So today I'm going to just go into some of the details of the WASH Sustainability Index tool. It is composed of three basic components: the PDF guiding document, which has two different versions, a complete version that's about 370 megabytes and contains a number of explanatory videos, and then a smaller version which was developed for those with a slower internet connection. Both the complete and the smaller versions have a series of locked and unlocked Excel framework sheets, and I will go into more details about the difference between those two. Both the complete and smaller PDF versions can be downloaded at the WASHplus website shown here. So to download the PDF, you go to the WASHplus website and you'll select which one you want to download. If we wanted to download the complete version, we would follow the link, and in most cases your web browser will download to a temporary folder as shown here, the zipped file. So what you'll need to do is unzip that file, the USAID WASH zip file, and in that you will find another folder of the same name, and copy that folder and its contents to a permanent location such as your desktop. The tool will not function if it is opened from a temporary location. So once you've copied that subfolder into a permanent location such as your desktop, you will open it up and you'll find a PDF document as well as another subfolder called Resources. So if you open up the PDF document, you will find the step-by-step detailed guidance on the procedures of the WASH Sustainability Index tool, which also includes the embedded videos. Shown here is the introductory page, and this also includes the Excel frameworks, which I will talk about. The videos, there are a total of 7 videos, including an introductory video which explains the navigation through the PDF. So after watching this, you will find various camera icons which link to videos that are embedded at the end of the PDF document that you can use that explain some of the different processes of the tool. A number of these, 3 of the 6 videos that are on the content side, 3 of the videos have accompanying Excel files which are downloaded from the exact page in which the videos contain. So you'll see an orange box in the upper right-hand corner of that page, which you can then select to download the Excel files. And when downloading the Excel files, this is the explanatory video files and also the additional framework files, a launch file dialog box will appear. And this is because the PDF is essentially accessing the files found in the resource subfolder which you downloaded previously. So you will say to open this, and which then should launch into the required file. So the Excel frameworks, there are a total of 7 framework files, and there's each file is for one specific indicator type. There are 7 locked files, which are found in section 2.1, and these have the ability to change only the content in the pink cells. And basically this is going to allow you to see the aggregation process. It allows you to adjust the weighting factors found at the top, as well as the scores used for the different indicators and sub-indicator values. And then in section 5, in the resources section, are the unlocked spreadsheets, which allow you to modify all content. So let's talk a little bit more about the specific components of the framework. Each of the specific rows in the framework files has a reference code, and this is used to keep track of the indicators and sub-indicators and questions as you create specific questionnaires or surveys from the framework files. So I'll now go into detail explaining what the different components of this reference code mean. So the first component is the intervention category. So the 2 letters that are used are WT for water, SN for sanitation, and HY for hygiene. And these have the following icons on the PDF, and then are also color coordinated on the PDF. The intervention types that have been is the second component. And we have developed framework spreadsheets for a total of 10 intervention types to date. And however, with the PDF that's available at the WASHplus website, 7 are included. And that is because we are currently working with the tool in 2 additional countries. And so those frameworks are available for those that are interested. And those are shown here. And so the acronyms are shown. CRS for Community Reticulated Systems. We see the first 6 are water interventions, so would carry the acronym or abbreviation of WT. The 7 and 8 are sanitation, and the 9 and 10, the last 2, are hygiene interventions. The third component of the reference code is the sustainability factor. References 5 sustainability factors which we have found, based upon an extensive desk review, to be the most important factors affecting the sustainability of services. And these are institutional, management, financial, technical, and environmental. The color coding throughout the framework sheets corresponds to the color coding shown here. Hopefully you can see that unless you're working on a low resolution monitor or black and white. The fourth component of the reference code refers to the administrative level. And if we just take an example of a country where we're currently applying the Sustainability Index tool in Tanzania, we have the WASH Sustainability Index code for the administrative level of N for national, D for district, and S for service. And these would correspond to the administrative levels in the country of Tanzania as shown here. So we have the republic and the regional level corresponding to the national, and then what we are referring to as the district includes not only the district level, but also the subdivision of the district, which is the division and local ward. And then services are taking place for the interventions in Tanzania that we were assessing at the village and sub-village level. So here we see the overall, in the last, the fifth component is the indicator number. We see is shown here. And so if we take the example in the green box that we see, the WTCRS ES1, what that's standing for is water intervention, community reticulated system. It's the environment factor, and it's the first indicator at the service provision level or at the service level. In addition, we do also have sub-indicators and questions. And so to keep these straight, we add an additional level or code shown here. So we have the factors, as we discussed, 5 factors: institutional, management, technical, financial, and environmental, and the codes shown. We have the indicators, approximately 1 to 4 per factor. And then for each intervention type, we have between 14 and 23 for the existing intervention types described. And these indicators would each have a number, so we might have 1 through 4, depending upon the numbers that we have for each factor. And then the sub-indicators, there are usually 4 per indicator, and those are A through D. And then in some cases, we have the sub-indicators are really composed of 2 or more questions. So those would then also carry a sub-designation of I, etc. But in many cases, the sub-indicator is actually a question, and so it is there's no subdivision of that. Okay, so if we see this is take just one example of an indicator here. That the Water Committee demonstrates effective financial management and accounting. We see the 4 sub-indicators, and so if we see, in addition, we have these 2 additional columns, the primary method of investigation and the method of triangulation. So the SP stands for service provider. And so that would be the primary, so in the case of a water committee, for this one, the CRS, the service provider would likely be a water board or a community water committee or a village management committee. And so they would be the primary unit of investigation. They would be the ones where you would be directing the survey questions to. And then in the case of the sub-indicator C, we'd also be asking questions to the household to corroborate the information provided by the service provider. And in some cases, the sub-indicator question is a series of questions which need to be asked. So for example, if we look at this sub-indicator, for CRS, the financial service level, second indicator B, so we see it in bold font there. If we separate this sub-indicator into its 2 specific questions, what is the annual revenue, and then what are the annual operating expenditures? These would be the specific questions that are asked to the Water Committee. An important issue with regard to the methodology of the Sustainability Index tool is the scoring. Some questions can be scored in the field, such as the previous question, in which you noted if we look back, we see the annual revenue and the annual operating expenditures. So once we know that information, we can compare the 2, and then we know that if the annual revenue is greater than the annual operating expenditures, that would be coded as a yes, and if it was no, then it would be coded as if it was less than, it would be coded as a no. So that would be a case where you could the enumerator could do scoring right on the questionnaire, and so that would be an example of field scoring. And the majority of the sub-indicators and the questions are designed, or can be designed, so that they are field scored. However, sometimes it's beneficial to collect additional information, such as service level indicators such as distance, if you're doing a household survey, distance of the household from the water point. So sometimes it's beneficial to collect the continuous data. And so in that case, you would do if you're collecting numerical data, then you would have to do post-collection scoring and look at maybe the average or compare it to international benchmarks if there are no national benchmarks available. So this is not only beneficial for the program that you're monitoring, but it can also add to the final analysis. Okay, now we'll just talk in general about the application of the tool. So the first step when applying the tool is to identify the scope of the assessment in what we term landscaping. So for this, you need to determine the full range of intervention types that are going to be included in the assessment, and we need to determine the location of the interventions. So the community or the smallest administrative unit. We found that it's beneficial to do this because it helps to identify the scale, the number of locations where the interventions have taken place, and then also to distinguish between unique interventions, because in many cases if you have a reticulated system in an urban area, there may be subcommittees and there may be a lot of essentially, although it's the same one infrastructure, there may be a number of different management groups, a number of different service providers within that single infrastructure project. So that's important to distinguish. With regard to the statistical design and sampling, the general design is, we have to remember that the focus is on service providers, and so the primary unit of analysis is important and dictates whether or not we're calculating a statistically significant sample size. So in the case where we have the intervention, the primary unit of analysis is the household. In that case, we say it's appropriate to calculate, use statistical significance to calculate the number of households that would be included in the household level surveys. But there are situations where we're using household data primarily to triangulate the information provided by the service providers. And so in those cases, we're calling those community level interventions. And so it would be a comprehensive inclusion of the service providers. So in this case, water community reticulated systems, we would have the water management organization. And so we would include all the water management organizations in that community. And then we would use what I term a best practice minimum sample size. And we suggested 25 in rural areas in previous surveys and 30 in urban areas, with the understanding that this is not statistically significant as a representation of that population, but it does provide, it's adequate for triangulation purposes. And then also because we're in urban areas and we're defining usually neighborhoods within those areas where we're collecting that information. So it's important to capture, recognize the heterogeneity, and in most cases, if you're dealing with neighborhoods, the inter-community or inter-neighborhood difference is greater than the intra-community or inter-neighborhood difference. So we also want to recognize that there are limited resources when you're going in and doing these studies. So we found that less is more, and that to improve the heterogeneity, we want to include more service providers and more districts as opposed to including more communities in a single district or more neighborhoods within a single urban area, or including, including more neighborhoods and communities as opposed to including more households in any single community or neighborhood. So, and then also the final thing that we found is that obviously stratification requires very specific knowledge, and so you want to represent that heterogeneity by in capturing the geographic differences, regional difference, rural-urban differences, and also any cultural differences. Okay, and so this the sampling strategy that's proposed in the document is based upon a literature review of 16 different assessment sampling strategies. And an important distinction Maybe some statisticians would take issue with it, but the important distinction is that we're not trying to do an impact assessment here. Which impact assessment is we would be comparing to a baseline, and we would have possibly controls, and we would be focusing on the beneficiaries or the users or the households. The sustainability index tool is about trying to understand the context of the interventions and the risk factors and success factors with regards to sustainability. And its focus is on the flow of services, and we found that service providers are the crucial elements to that sustainability, and so therefore, because we collect a lot of data with regard to service providers and also at the support institutions at the district and municipal levels, there's less of a focus on the beneficiaries as with regard to the field data collection. So the next step, once we've determined our sample size, is to begin to create the questionnaires. And so you would do this by using the filter tab, which is found on the left-hand side of each of the framework spreadsheets. Each of the indicator questions has a specific primary unit of analysis, and so you use that filter tab to create the questionnaires. So if you want to create a questionnaire for the service providers, you would select all of the cells that have the service providers, filter those out, and then create separate spreadsheets for that specific stakeholder. And then, as you can see, and as was mentioned earlier, some of the sub-indicators and questions are triangulated, so they have multiple stakeholders. So for these ones shown here, we see that the primary unit of analysis is the service provider, and then also the household. Okay, so the next step, which is a very important step, is the contextualization, which is composed of a number of two main steps. But it's important to recognize that this can be very time-consuming, and it's important to engage local authorities and WASH experts. But the basic way this is done is that you take the general questions, the sub-indicators listed in the framework, and then what we would do is we create the specific questions. So in situations where you would be asking, because we have different stakeholders, those sub-indicators, when directing those questions to households, you would phrase the question differently than you may to a service provider or to a district authority. And so it's important to phrase those correctly and appropriately, and then also to adapt the general sub-indicators as shown in the framework using local benchmarks and standards and norms for the country in which you'll be collecting data. It's very important to pilot test the tool before using it. So it's important, the first step is to pre-test the tool with the survey team, and that's typically done at the end of training of the enumerators. And the idea is to organize the different data collection tools to ensure proper flow. And so then once you've created those specific questionnaires, you would identify communities that have received the interventions that you would be selecting to pilot test the tools, with the understanding that the data that's used cannot be included in the final analysis. And the pilot test is considered a dry rehearsal of the actual data collection. So you would treat it as if it were any day, and going through all the motions of that as you will do in the final data collection. And the objective of the pilot test is to ensure that each of the questions that's asked by the different enumerators is interpreted in the same way by the respondent. So it's important to note anytime that the enumerators have to qualify questions and so on and so forth. So you need to make sure that you have sufficient time after the pilot test to receive feedback from the enumerators and make modifications to the tools. The WASH Sustainability Index tool uses household surveys and observations. There's also some system and facility observations. Some of the sub-indicators are observations or require that the enumerator verify conditions. And then also we like to think of the questionnaires that are done with the service providers and the district levels as more key informant interviews that can allow for some qualitative responses in addition to the questions specific to the framework. And then also there's quite a bit of observation and review of document that's done in the communities, but then also the national level surveys can be done partially via a document review or a desk-based exercise. So the data collection teams consist of a country coordinator and the survey team leads, and then also teams of enumerators that are going to be doing the household questionnaires, which can be done either on paper or on handsets. So once the data is collected, the field-coded data will be in the form of a no or yes response. So the way it can be analyzed is by just looking at the percent yeses. So in this example, we see that we have a number of household responses in the far left column, and those would be aggregated to a single sub-indicator response. In this case, let's say that 66% of the households responded yes. And then all those sub-indicators, some of which would be household, if the household was the primary unit of analysis. Others might be the service provider for those sub-indicators. Those would be aggregated to the indicator level. So we go from the question to the sub-indicator to the indicator and finally to the factor. And there's the option of including weighting factors at each one of these stages. However, it's important to recognize that this may introduce a bias, so it's important that you engage local government, WASH sector experts, implementing partners, and perhaps even the donor organizations when discussing how you would do the weighting factors. It's very important to consider, so with regard to triangulation, so as previously mentioned, we have multiple, there are indicators that have multiple stakeholders or multiple respondents at different levels, and so it's important to determine how you're going to do triangulation. So in our previous experience, we've done triangulation utilizing the lower level as saying that, for example, if the households in aggregate responded, the majority said yes, as compared to the service provider who said no to a specific sub-indicator question, we went with the lower level, so the household response, the aggregate household response. But sometimes it may be more appropriate to average the two or to consider some other way to come up with a final response. As I mentioned, the weighting factors, it's possible to include those at different stages, and as is shown in the framework files provided, but care needs to be taken when deciding that. And then the final results can be used to generate different types of graphs. But as under the current framework, this needs to be done manually. So we see that this is just an example of the results for the Dominican Republic we found. So we see the factor score by community. So this shows the 5 factors by community for one specific intervention, shown as a radar plot. Then we can also present the results by intervention type and looking at the overall factor scores. And so you would have, in this case, we have the community reticulated system results for the 5 different sustainability factors. We would have that one of these bar graphs for each of the intervention types in the program being assessed. It's important to note that with regard to presenting the graphs, who your target audience is, so it may be appropriate to present different levels of aggregation for different levels. So the national may be more interested in the bar graph, whereas the district level may be interested in the disaggregated information. So thank you very much, and I will now field any questions.
So just to give you a little bit of information about how we'll transition to Q&A, there's a questions box in the webinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We welcome your questions, so please enter them in that box. We'll field questions and try to aggregate questions that are very similar. We'll turn it over to Ryan to answer those questions, and then we'll come back and look for another question. So the first question that we'd like to address is, how do you suggest incorporating the use of the tool into program cycles so that information is available before programmatic decisions are made?
Okay, Helen, thank you very much. It's Harold Lockwood speaking here. So just to switch things over a bit, I think this is a good question, a big question that's been discussed quite a lot. To be clear, this tool, when we developed this together with USAID and Rotary, it was specifically for post-investment assessment. So looking backwards in time, looking at the performance of services and trying to identify those risk factors that Ryan was talking about in terms of the design of the tool. So that's the primary function of the tool itself when it was designed. Having said that, of course, through the development of indicators that are available in the spreadsheets that can be downloaded, those can be applied, I think, at different points in the cycle. They may be useful for suggesting indicators for others to use. They could be used as a complete set. But I think an important point that I would make in terms of the bigger picture and the use of this tool, and there are other tools out there that have similar structures, one developed by UNICEF, and there are a couple of others that we know of. One of the most important things to note in all of these is that no program, no operation, no investment exists in isolation or in a vacuum. So we can look backwards at what's happened to help us inform what we do going forwards. Even if it may not be USAID or Rotary that's invested in previous programs, we can always learn from what's happened in the past. And I think that's one of the key kind of takeaways at a higher level for me anyway during this process, is that that process of analysis after you've done all these questionnaires and you've applied the tool, which is an in-depth, complex process, but sustainability is a complex thing. We have to use those lessons, look at those trends, and feed those back to stakeholders on the ground, to governments, to local stakeholders, and try and identify and dig deeper as to why. Why are service providers weak? We can get quite a lot of indications from the tool, but we need to use that information in a proactive way. We need to disseminate. So there's steps after you've applied the tool I think are important to flag, which have costs, of course. We can reduce everything down to something very simple. So just point a smartphone at something, take a picture, and grab some data. But that'll only tell us a very narrow answer, if you like. So I think this can be used in other parts of the cycle to answer your question. But we have to make sure that the outputs are actually communicated well, that they fit into a broader process. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Harold. I want to carry on with another question from the group. What are some of the key learnings that have been obtained from using the tool to date?
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so talking from our experience to date in the Dominican Republic, Ghana, and the Philippines, and then also the experiences so far in Kenya and Tanzania, we found that contextualization is extremely important, and therefore sufficient time and resources need to be dedicated to the process of contextualization. And then we've also found that the results are much more meaningful if you can have the more contextualized, the better. In addition, we found with the first iteration of the tool in the Dominican Republic, Ghana, and the Philippines, there's definite added benefit to doing the national level surveys initially, and then subsequently doing the district level surveys, and then visiting the communities So going from the top down, often because it gives you, you can see the big picture, and you can address some of the issues and identify some of the what could be potential risk factors to sustainability in the enabling environment, and then also allows you to identify the benchmarks and facilitates the contextualization process. So beginning from the national level and going downwards. And then finally, we really feel that just the process of conducting the WASH Sustainability Index is, because it's not just an activity where you're pointing an app at something or doing something very simplistic, very cursory. This is more of an in-depth assessment, and we think holistic assessment that looks at sustainability through the lens of the national scale down to the community. So we think that it really is a capacity building, and we've had a number of the different organizations that have been involved in the execution of the sustainability check comment to that effect, and we believe that it's building the capacity of these organizations, and there's definite value added to continuing to do similar types of assessments, in the same countries, because you have this significant investment in the development of the tool, and then to a certain extent, a lot of the activities for the first assessment can be utilized and built upon for the subsequent assessments. So, yeah.
So thanks, Ryan. We have a number of questions coming in that are about very specific issues about how to use the tool. So I think I'm going to start with those and then go to the more general questions. So one of them is, gender equity and other social concerns typically contribute to sustainable service delivery. In what category, if any, do these criteria appear? So Ryan or Harold, do you want to take that question?
Oh, sorry. I had a really great explanation, and I was still on mute. So I'll try to rephrase. So we believe that gender and equity are extremely important, and although it's not a standalone factor, it's included in each of the sustainability factors. So we see that specifically in definitely in the management and the technical, we see gender specific issues. I don't know the specific indicators, but it is a cross-cutting included in the factors.
Thank you. The next question we have is, do you have generic instruments to assess sustainability of WASH programs? And if so, can they be adapted? So I think this is getting back to how much adaptation is required in the Excel spreadsheets in order to get started.
Okay, Helen, I'll try and answer this one. I think with respect to the tool that we've been working on, the Sustainability Index tool, we deliberately made the structure of the tool and the way of the process itself open to change, so that, in other words, we recognize that in different countries, and even probably in different regions within countries, but certainly within different countries, you're going to have nuances, sometimes quite large differences in how services are defined, how service providers are recognized, and certainly in terms of norms and standards. So an example might be, we know that assessing the time it takes to repair a system, whether it's a pipe system or a hand pump or less so, I guess, a household latrine, but stick to water for now, that's quite an important aspect of long-term sustainability from a technical perspective. Different countries will have different norms and standards to say it's so many days a month or it's so many weeks a year that the system should be down before it's repaired, for example. So this tool allows you to modify the questions depending on which country you're in. So I think the first answer to that question is that we deliberately made this a bespoke system so that it can be made flexible. I talked about some similar tools that are out there developed by others, including notably UNICEF, who developed something called a sustainability check. And those have been done in now 5 countries, and each one is tailored to that country, so it's quite a specific tool. Now you can argue, well, you can say, well, it could be a benefit to be country specific, but if you want to scale this up, if you want to replicate, as I think the second part of the question was, that makes it quite difficult because you've got a locked-in set of questions and indicators that are really geared towards one particular country context. And I think this question finally points to a broader issue in that, is there a demand for a generic instrument or generic components which you could sort of pull off the shelf, as it were? And my sense is, from having been involved in looking at these different tools and the development of one of them, that probably yes, there is. These can be made perhaps simpler to use and perhaps with generic components that can be pulled off the shelf, but we don't want to lose the inbuilt complexity which is necessary to understand a complex problem. So I think in the long run it probably would be a good idea to try and develop such a generic instrument. And at the moment this is one of the most flexible that we know of out there. Heather? Oh, Helen, sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Harold. You know, there are several questions that ask about how you receive a copy of the tool or how you see the results publicly. I just want to refer you back to the WASHplus website at www.washplus.org/Rotary-USAID, because you'll find a number of publications there, including the results and the tool itself, that you can download for more information. So just be sure that you know those resources are there. The next question for Harold and Ryan is a question about weightings. Do the weightings add any value? Surely they are just too subjective and introduce unhelpful biases.
So, Helen, in the first iteration of the tool in the Dominican Republic, Ghana, and the Philippines, we decided against using weightings, and that was after significant discussion internally and then also externally with the in-country partners, implementing partners. And you can really go back and forth and discuss what the value and risks are, or risk benefits of including weightings. And I think everybody will probably have an opinion one way or the other. And so that's why I think it's really context dependent. So we did build in the flexibility in the examples provided in the framework sheets. You'll see at the top there's space for weighting factors for the sustainability factors, and then also there's essentially a built-in score for each of the sub-indicators, which is essentially a weighting factor. So I think that you use those at your own risk, but if there's significant justification for using it, I think it is appropriate.
Thank you. There are several questions here about data quality, and maybe we can address this in a generic way. I don't know that it's specific to the tool. For example, in some cultures, people are far more likely to tell you what you want to hear. Or how is the data that goes into the tool quality controlled? So maybe you could speak a little bit to the quality control that you might have carried out in the past.
Yes, those are really great questions and valid concerns. So anybody that's done any amount of field data collection understands the importance of triangulation, and so that's why we are collecting information from multiple stakeholders. Within the community, we would be collecting, for example, in Tanzania, we're collecting information not only at the district level, but we're also collecting at the division level, and then local ward level, and then within the villages, we're talking to the village executive officer, the village council, and then the specific service providers with regard to the interventions. So that could be a water point management group, also local technicians and households. And so sometimes you're asking the same question to maybe 2 or 3 different stakeholders. It adds to the complexity of the final analysis because you have to determine how you're going to do that calculation with regard to triangulation, but it does add a validation and does ensure the quality of your data. Other ways that we're doing, so with regard to the quality, I mean certainly just regular data management. So if you're doing paper surveys, and data entry is important. So I'm not exactly sure if that was what the question was directed at, but so there's multiple issues with regard to data quality control. And we found that also it's very simple to do the household surveys, to build those into a handheld. You know, some Akvo Flow or different technologies, Kobo. There's many open source programs available to do that. And the integration into the tool is relatively straightforward.
Ryan, thank you. Again, there are some more questions about how we might be able to see the webinar after this is finished. The webinar will be posted on this same website that we mentioned before, the washplus.org website /Rotary-USAID. So please go there if you're looking for more information. There's another question here about what level is the tool most useful. Based on the presentation, it sounds like the tool is ideally suited for a local service provider or a small geographic area. Has the tool been tested on a national scale? And if so, what challenges has this posed?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. The application, I think there's 2 issues in that question, which is a very good one. Firstly, at what level? I mean, all levels are important, of course. You need well-designed and well-built physical infrastructure. You need good performing operators, whether they're community entities, whether they're local private sector. You need certainly, in my opinion, you need a strong support system from some level of scale above individual communities to do more complex tasks and sometimes more independent interventions like conflict resolution, help with auditing, help with complex repairs, which typically come from a district, a municipality, or a higher level, could be somewhere between the decentralized local government level and national. So in that sense, those 2 levels are very important. And I think something that kind of gets missed in a lot of these evaluations that look just at the level of the system or the household in the case of latrines is that you also need well-functioning policy environments, legislation, approaches to subsidies and so on. Just like in our countries in the north, we have regulators, we have systems that are set out clearly in terms of who should pay what, who should do what. These are incredibly important. I think sometimes get lost when people are working right down at that level of the community. So one answer to that question is that all 3 levels, and if we say there are 3 basically, the community or including household and service provider, the district and the national, so all 3 are important. In terms of applying this nationally, even though we looked in the 5 countries so far that we've done it at a fairly limited number of interventions in each case, although I think in the first round in 3 countries we looked at over 2,000 household surveys, so across the board it was not a tiny survey. We did apply those indicators at national level also, so we looked at the existence and the relative quality of policies on financing, on support functions. So we did apply the tool nationally, even though the actual interventions were much smaller scale. I mean, I don't suppose that any of us are going to actually do a complete national survey in that sense. Maybe you can do it in a one-off like we did in Liberia with the Akvo Flow, but that just gives a map of coverage and some other attributes. But to do this kind of thing in depth would be very difficult to do it across the board. But we have applied the national level parts of the tool, as explained by Ryan, at national level. So I hope that answers the question. Back to you, Helen.
Yeah, Harold, thank you. The next question is about level of effort. And the question is, what was the range and level of effort required to implement the tool in each of the countries? And maybe you could just talk about level of effort in general.
We pulled out our calculator.
Fantastic.
Okay, so roughly it's approximately 3 to 4 months for doing the the assessment. Now we're doing an assessment currently in 2 countries, and so we have 2 of our staff working on that, and then we've hired 2 different in-country organizations that are have been involved in the contextualization, and then are conducting all of the service provider and household level surveys. With myself and my colleague here at Lockwood Consult doing the district and national level surveys. And so, as I said, 3 to 4 months. Man or person hours, I'm not sure, but about 50,000 approximately on that, the first iteration, with subsequent iterations being less expensive because there is this one-time contextualization costs, which can be a significant percentage of that overall cost.
Maybe, Helen, if I can just build on Ryan's point and perhaps clarify, is that okay?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So the contextualization Ryan was referring to was, we built the tool to respond to the first application, which covered 9 intervention types. So this is, the whole thing is built around the type of intervention you're making. So is it a reticulated system? Is it a household latrine? Is it a school institutional latrine? So in the second round we had 3 additional intervention types. So when Ryan said the cost of doing those, adding that contextualization, it was to add those 3 interventions. Now in theory, if you want to take this tool and apply it to a anaerobic fecal sludge management plant, you'd have to create another set of questions. Now, not all questions and not all indicators are new every time. Some of them will stay the same, especially at the higher level, but there is a certain amount of work involved in looking at a new intervention type. Once you've got those, then you enter into that cycle, as Ryan said, and it's also how long is a piece of string, how big is your sample required, how dispersed the population. So in Tanzania, where we're doing now, the costs are fairly high because it's a long way from the capital city, certainly, but it's dispersed. In a country like the Dominican Republic, for example, lower logistical costs. Obviously, the country's smaller, and so on. But as a rough rule of thumb, for these programs of this size that we've been looking at, it's cost around $50,000–$60,000. That's the sort of financial costs. And I think Ryan answered the question about the human resources. Over to you.
Thank you, Harold. That was some great extra information. I just wanted to let you know that there are about 3 minutes left in our hour-long presentation, but there are still many questions that you've submitted. What I'd like to suggest is that we would stay on for an extra 10 minutes to try to address some of these questions. Some of them are very relevant to the use of the tool. So Harold and Ryan, will that be all right to stay on for 10 more minutes to address some more of these questions?
It's fine with us as long as we've got the go-to.
Great. So I'll continue then with a few more of the questions that have been submitted. The next one is that you have great data on the sustainability factors for the systems on the radar plot. Have you compared the actual performance of those systems relative to the factors shown on the plot?
So I assume the question is talking about service levels and functionality. And so with assuming that's the case, we haven't done a specific explicit comparison, and also because of the nature of our assessment, I think it's difficult to just say, okay, a cross-sectional study that would collect functionality data or service level data, and to say, well, how does that play out over time? So although I think there is some benefit to understanding what the functionality is, I think it would be more appropriate to say, are we doing a comparison of our outputs to functionality levels and service levels over time? So we haven't engaged in any specific comparison of our data with functionality information over time. But I think that would be an interesting study, and perhaps something which maybe USAID or Rotary would be interested in funding.
Ryan, thank you. And yes, I agree. It would be a very interesting study. We can talk offline about funding. So another question that's come up is that some people will still say that tool is complicated with a lot of pre-work to make it usable. How can we use the risk factors, et cetera, to plan the projects better? Do you have any comments about how you would use this differently if you wanted to use it in planning?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. This is clearly a subject that keeps coming back and back, and I think it's an important one, of course. Look, I think the tool as we developed it was designed to show trends. As Ryan said clearly, it's not a one-for-one impact assessment tool. It's designed to give indications, and if you look at the reports from especially the Dominican Republic and Ghana from the first trial of this tool, you can see some quite nice and quite clear trending around, for example, capacity of district level to provide these support functions, and that's shown in a number of different ways, visually shown from the data. We can use, so that flags clearly as a risk. So in very simplistic terms, in the Dominican Republic, you had weak central level in terms of policy enabling environments. You had also fairly weak local government, and you had fairly strong community level operators. That was as a caricature. In Ghana, you had a different kind of a picture emerging. You can use that information about that particular factor to then start a dialogue, to start an analysis, depending on the level at which you're intervening. You know, if you're a program, you're looking at the design of a future program. Okay, we know now from the results of such a tool that we have basically very weak central government, decentralized government, local government. You could say, well, do we need a complex tool to tell us that? Probably not. You know, people have an intuitive knowledge of what's going on in the country, but this gives a bit more rigorous data behind that to say, you know, we've carried out the study, we've looked at these different factors, and this is the, you know, this is what's going on. So we can use that to anticipate in the design of our program going forward, how would you mitigate that risk of having a very weak local government? One answer could be to bypass it altogether and to work around it and set up a parallel system of support. Another one through, you know, associations of committees, this kind of thing. Another one could be to say, well, we need to help target that and support local government to do its job better. So I think that's the level at which we're talking about the use of the outputs, and that could apply to financial factors. So you say, you know, typically we would expect, and the results from the first pilot showed that indeed, and the second case we don't know yet because we haven't got the full results out, that, for example, tariff payments are too low really to cover long-term capital replacement costs. Yeah, is that new news? Probably not to those of us who have worked in the sector, but it gives you the evidence you need to start that dialogue to say to policymakers, you're going to have a problem here, even though you think communities can just take over this stuff and run these things forever. They're not, because our survey, our assessment shows that this is consistently a weak factor. So I think it's at that level that it's very important, and I go back to my earlier comment from one of the first questions. The purpose of this tool is not to produce nice graphs and lots of data sets. The purpose of the tool is to use those outputs to go back and engage with the stakeholders involved, engage internally within your organizations at USAID or at other organizations to say, you know, we may have thought that things are all going fine, but in reality we can see that there are these weaknesses here and there are strengths over there. How can we build on the strengths and tackle the weaknesses? And I think Ryan is indicating he wants to also provide some answer to the question, so I'll mute myself.
Yeah, thanks, Harold. Just to build quickly upon what Harold said, which I agree with, is that in addition, the tool and the indicators that are targeting different levels through the triangulation process, it really allows you to not only maybe uncover some things which, as Harold say, were perhaps already known, so already uncovered. But they also recognize these, you identify these symptoms, but then you also understand the perspective of the different stakeholders at the different levels and how they view the risks of those symptoms or how they impact the sustainability of the systems. So, for example, we talk about the resources at the district level being insufficient. Maybe that was one of our findings, for example, in the Dominican Republic. Well, so maybe in some situations, perhaps it's the resources are insufficient, but do we know the types of resources? And do the different stakeholders understand what the needs are of the different levels? So you see this comes up with regard to the triangulation when you ask different stakeholders, at the national level and then at the district level, with regard to the support services and the training of individuals, the district staff, and is it a human resources issue, or is it a financial issue, or what is the specific issues? And it's important to understand the different perspectives, and then to when you're proposing solutions, address those perspectives and address those needs. And so I think that's one of the unique things of the tool is that it uncovers some of these differences in perspectives simply by looking at the responses and the triangulation and understanding, even if you have a perfectly functioning system, if you have people at all the different levels having totally dichotomous or diverging opinions or views or perspectives on what's occurring, that is a sustainability risk in and of itself, right? So communication is very important, especially with regard to within government.
So Harold and Ryan, thank you. That was a great explanation. I want to continue on to a completely different topic. Gender has been raised in several of these questions, and the questions go something like, gender is a cross-cutting issue, but merely saying that doesn't mean it will be addressed. It's not clear in the data collection method mentioned, in particular the surveys, how the data might be disaggregated by sex and gender. And also, how do we mainstream gender into sustainability analyses? So maybe you could just talk generally as to how you see gender analysis coming into this sustainability system.
Hi, Helen. Yeah, I think that's probably a tricky question to answer in the sense that you could create a separate factor around gender equity issues. And in the tools we looked at, other than this one particularly, a couple of them did include that, not all by any means. But I think it also comes back to a broader discussion. Do we think that necessarily having greater representation of women, for example, leads to better sustainability? Is there an empirical case for that? Is it shown to be the case that that really makes a difference? So I'm not sure whether this question is a broader reflection of how you see the role of equity in the sustainability equation. Certainly the questions are in there, and the disaggregation for interviews at household level is there because we know who we ask questions to, and data can be presented by gender. So you can, that's the thing with the data. Once it's collected, once it's entered into the Excel sheets, you can analyze it, you can manipulate that data in the neutral sense of the word manipulate, to show you the different responses and different perspectives.
Just to jump in as well. I think it's very important to try and mainstream it. And so one of the things which I think, obviously this is a living tool, and I think there's a lot of criticisms that can be made about the structure of it, and so we encourage those so that we can improve it. And I think one of the ways in which you could possibly mainstream gender is to essentially have all of those gender without adding a factor, or maybe it would be more appropriate to add a factor. So that's a separate discussion. But in the way it exists, the existing framework, one of the ways in which you could mainstream gender in the tool is to have a composite gender index where you would identify all of the different sub-indicators and indicators that deal specifically with gender, and then have some kind of gender scoring that would come out of that. So that would be one way in the existing, so this is kind of this additional analysis that Harold is talking about. You could pull out, how the gender components of each of the intervention types, and you could have that across interventions. Because there is a number of indicators which deal exclusively with equity and non-discrimination, and also include gender. And I think they're significant, but perhaps in certain areas I'm sure it could be definitely improved in that respect.
Thanks, Ryan. So at this point, I think we've reached the end of most of the questions. We didn't hit every one of them, but I think we hit the basic categories. And I'd really like to thank both Harold Lockwood and Ryan Schweitzer and AgriConsult on behalf of the International Water Alliance between Rotary and USAID for the webinar today and the really thoughtful responses to numerous questions. And I'd like to encourage you as the audience to visit the website at www.washplus.org/Rotary-USAID, as we will continue to post information there. We'll post updates, we'll post extra information about the tool, we'll post results there as they come in, and we would also welcome your feedback. And Dan Campbell at the WASHplus project is collecting that feedback if you want to send him your input, your questions, and so on. And we'll look at that before any revisions would be made to the tool in the future. So we'd like to thank you for your participation and especially thank Harold and